Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to this event. My name is Chris Jones. I'm from the University of St Andrews, and I will just sort of set the scene a little bit, and then our two star performers will take over. The University of St Andrews is 600 years old this year. Other people like to celebrate birthdays with cake and champagne, but we've just had a 3.5-day conference with historians and literary academics and art historians and musicologists and philosophers discussing why the Middle Ages matter in modernity, and the ways in which ideas about the Middle Ages are still found in our political discourse and in our art and in our culture. We also had a number of writers and broadcasters and curators, so that the Academy was talking outside of itself, and it was jolly good fun. Your two speakers here were at the conference. I'll be introducing each of them in turn. And I'm terribly grateful to the British Academy for supporting us in this event by bringing our second speaker, Patrick Geary, into the country. And the British Academy said it would be lovely to have a small version of this conference coming down from Scotland as part of their events programme. So we're going to hear each speaker give a short version of their St Andrews talk, approximately half an hour, and then we're going to open up and have a discussion between the two speakers and yourselves about what the Middle Ages means in modernity. Our first speaker doesn't need very much introduction at all. He is the greatest comic writer and actor, perhaps, of our generation. You all know and love him, no doubt, because of his work with Monty Python's Flying Circus, and deservedly so. What you might not know is that Terry is also a scholar of medieval literature, of distinction in his own right. He's written a very important book about Chaucer's Knight, with a very controversial thesis that is still argued over almost 30 years after its publication. Terry is also a great popularizer of other historians' work on the Middle Ages, of course, with his TV shows such as Medieval Lives and Barbarians and the Crusades and so on. Today he's going to talk to us about one of the characters who, in certain narratives of when the Middle Ages end, occupies a certain position, and that's Christopher Columbus, who's sometimes taken in to usher in the age of modernity, of course. And I rather suspect he's going to come in for a jolly good trouncing over the next half an hour. So without further ado, please would you give an extremely warm welcome to Terry Jones.
Well, of course, we all know Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and discovered America, and thereby proving that the world is round. And we know about this because he's got a statue in New York in Columbus Circus dedicated to him. Before Columbus, of course, everybody thought the world was flat. And they had no idea of geography at all. As you can see from this, India's up there north, and then Africa, and France and Germany in the south, and Albania up there. That's a map from 1109. Now, the same thing happens in the Mappamundis of the 13th century. We can see the Red Sea is suitably red. Jerusalem is in the center of the earth. Rome is sighted to the south of it, and of course Adam and Eve up in the thing. Now, the reason why their maps were so bad is because they weren't maps. The map comes from Latin mappa, meaning the napkin. By the 14th century, it could mean a cloth. And they were history lessons. And you can see the departing of the Red Sea, for the sea parting for the Israelites to cross. There's Noah's Ark. There's Bethlehem. And there's Noah's Ark. There's the birthplace of Alexander the Great. And there's London, where the Westminster, where the map was made. And the sense of geography wasn't actually so bad. If you put it on this side, there's Asia on there, Europe north of the Mediterranean, and Africa south of the Mediterranean. And we have Portland charts from the 13th century. They give a good idea of the Mediterranean. You can see Italy there, and Spain there, and France there, and a pretty good representation of Great Britain. And anyway, there wouldn't have been any point in having maps in the Middle Ages, because you'd ask the way somewhere. You'd probably have a guide. And here you can see London, this is the pilgrim route. London and Journey, a day's travel to Rochester, and Journey to Canterbury, Journey to Dover. And that's why we get the journey from journée. Now, did people in the Middle Ages think the world was flat? Not until the 19th century did anybody suppose that the people in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat. The Greeks knew the world was round. After the 5th century BC, no Greek writer of repute thought the world was anything but round. Pythagoras said the world is round. Plato, it's round. Aristotle, it's round. And he also added, it is the interposition of the earth between the sun and moon that makes the eclipse. The form of this line will be caused by the form of the earth's surface, which is therefore spherical. Eratosthenes, who is the chief librarian in Alexandria, made a good guess about the circumference of the earth. He's actually 252,000 stadia, which works out as 39,000 kilometers. Actually, it's 40,000. It's an error of less than 1%. Ptolemy, whose geography became standard text for the Middle Ages, estimated the circumference of the Earth as 28,000 kilometers. It's a 28% error. But of course, we all know that classical learning was lost after the sack of Rome in 1410 by Alaric the Goth. Now, Alaric the Goth, actually, this is another myth. Alaric the Goth was himself a Christian, and he wanted to be a Roman. He ordered no buildings to be destroyed. He established safe houses in churches, and little rape or killing. So life went on as before. And in fact, a pagan lawyer in Carthage, Martianus Capella, said soon after the sack of Rome, the world is neither flat nor concave, but spherical. And this was the basis of academic learning from the 5th to the 12th centuries. Macrobius, one of the most influential books on medieval thought, the commentary on Cicero's dream of Scipio, wrote, describes the Earth as a globe of insignificant size compared to the rest of the cosmos. Did the church teach that the Earth was flat? Well, St. Augustine says the Bible doesn't say. So it doesn't matter if the pagan philosophers say it's a sphere, fine. And St. Isidore of Seville estimated the circumference of the Earth. The Venerable Bede said the Earth is round like a ball. And Friar Roger Bacon in the 13th century says the curvature of the Earth explains why we can see further from higher elevations. Nicholas of Resmy, Bishop of Lisieux, says the Earth is round like a ball. And he also even discussed the rotation of the Earth's sphere. We know poets and laymen knew the world. In the Franklin's Tale, this wide world, which that men say is round, I would it give if I were lord of it. And we've also got the orb and scepter. I mean, this is signifies Christ's domination of the world, and it's a globe. And you can see it in many representations on the Bayeux Tapestry, and it's in Richard II's thing. He's holding the orb and scepter. And it's on the money. It was on the money they used. So it's just quite obvious that nobody thought and they even considered gravity. Treaties, everything of weight tends towards the center. And this was required reading by students at all Western European universities for the next 4 centuries. Who believed the world was flat? Well, there were 2 people. Lucius Lactantius and Cosmos Indicopleustes. I can never say that name. Lucius said, "Is there anyone so silly as to believe that there are humans on the other side of their earth with their feet above their heads?" And Cosmos pictured the earth as a tabernacle, as a tent, spread out above the heavens. He wanted to prove that the pagan philosophers were wrong. Now, he was ignored. Cosmos Indicopleustes was ignored, and Lucius Lactantius was condemned for heresy. Now, this isn't Jesus signifying the second over. It's why? Why do we think the Middle Ages thought the world was flat? Well, it's all the fault of an American journalist called Washington Irving. He wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. He also wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus. And in 1828, or 1826 actually, in which he envisages Columbus at Salamanca castigating the church fathers for teaching that the world was flat. To his simplest proposition, the spherical form of the earth, were opposed figurative texts of scripture. They observed that in the Psalms, the heavens are said to be extended like a hide, and that St. Paul compares the heavens to a tabernacle or a tent extended over the earth, which they thence inferred must be flat. And the wonderful bit of purple prose here. Columbus, his commanding person, his elevated demeanor, his air of authority, his kindling eye, and the persuasive intonations of his voice, how they must have given majesty and force to his words, as casting aside his maps and charts and discarding for a time his practical and scientific lore, his visionary spirit took fire at the doctrinal objections of his opponents. Now, the thing is that Washington Irving made this all up. It's total nonsense. The Columbus Act did indeed go before a committee of inquiry, but it was Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish monarchs, to safeguard their investment. And they were always nervous about his plan to go across the earth. And sphericity was never mentioned. It was all about how far it was around from Europe to Asia. And Ptolemy said 50% land, 50% sea. So the circumference was 28,000 kilometers. The committee therefore thought that Europe to Japan was 14,000 kilometers. And Columbus had to persuade the committee that it was much, much less. Waste of money, time, too far, waste of money, of time and men. Damn. It's much less, much, much less. Trust me, says. Columbus had in order to prove that it was much less far, Columbus took the Bishop of Noyen's estimate of the land. It's 62.5% land, 37.5% sea. Europe to Japan, 10,800 kilometers on Ptolemy's estimate. Marco Polo, Columbus said, Marco Polo said China extends further to the east, knock off another 28 degrees, 8,640 kilometers Europe to Japan. Columbus, Japan, far to the east of China, knock off another 30 degrees, 79% land, 21% sea, 6,000 kilometers. And leaving from the Canaries, knock off another 9 degrees. Pierre Daly got it wrong, knock off another 8 degrees. Also fiddled with the length of nautical miles. And finally, he produced 4,458 kilometers. Actually, it's 22,000 kilometers. So he reduced the Earth to 20% of its actual size. And if God or good luck had not put the West Indies in his way to catch him, Columbus and his crews might indeed have perished from starvation and thirst. So religious bigot or clear-headed rationalist? I think con man and a pragmatist. I mean, Columbus was a con man who got lucky, but did he discover America? We have been, James W. Lowen, in his book, Lies My Teacher Taught Me, said we have been duped by an outrageous concoction of lies, half-truths, truths, and omissions that in a large part traceable to the first half of the 19th century. Before Columbus, particularly the sailors knew America existed. Islamic historians recount voyages from Mali in West Africa in 1311, and 500 years before Columbus, Leif Erikson established longhouses at Lens-aux-Meadows. And in fact, 5000 BC, there's a lot of pottery and fishing techniques that are similar to between Japan and Ecuador. So they made, and anyway, it was already populated. The Indians, they crossed over the Bering Strait and got to America that way. Columbus didn't discover America, and he didn't participate in the founding the American government or constitution. So why do most Americans regard him as the founder of their country? Columbus had one thing in his favor. During the War of Independence against the British, Columbus had one great advantage in his favor. Now, the textbooks like to mythologize Columbus. And the history textbooks are guilty of this. In the 19th century textbook, Columbus's motives purely scientific. They came from a knowledge of the shape of the earth, much superior to the general notions of the age in which he lived. We've actually, there's attempts to humanize Columbus, but we've no idea what he looked like. Columbus claimed to be Genoese. Evidence he was, evidence he wasn't. But the textbooks have no doubts. He came from humble origins, a poor weaver, or a prosperous wool weaver. We simply don't know. We don't even know where he thought he was going. All the textbooks are certain that he was heading for Japan and the East Indies. And Bartolome de las Casas, in his History of the Indies, India was known for its great wealth. To induce the monarchs, always doubtful about his enterprise, he said he was setting out in search of a western route to India. I think that's authoritative. And they the textbooks try and get elements of danger into the things. So he's storm battered in the land of promise. This is a textbook. Actually, in Columbus's journal, beautiful sailing weather. And how long was the voyage? 2 months? Some textbooks say. No, it's actually a month. And the story needs some drama. So Columbus, the hero, keeps his head while the crew begin to panic. The superstitious sailors grew increasingly mutinous because they were fearful of sailing over the edge of the world, says one textbook. The mutineers threatened to throw him overboard, textbooks claims. And it needs a tragic end. Because, you know, it makes a better myth. He died in neglect in 1506, the American Adventure textbook. He finally reaped only his misfortune and disgrace, a history of the United States, another textbook in current use. Now, he didn't die in poverty. He had a huge gold find on Haiti in 1499. Hundreds of thousands of natives were forced to mine, and the money continued to pour in. He died rich. He also knew he'd discovered a new world. I've come to believe that this is a mighty continent which was hitherto unknown. I'm greatly supported in this view by the reason of this great river and by the sea which is fresh. And actually, he added a continent to the islands on his shield. First encounter with the Arawaks, who populated most of the West Indies. Great multitudes, he was favorably impressed by them. Great multitudes of men came to the shore, all young and of fine shapes and very handsome. Their eyes are large and very beautiful. And then he says, I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I pleased. It wasn't a voyage of exploration. And he had one thought in his mind, gold. And right from the beginning, gold is most excellent. Gold constitutes treasure. And he who has it does all he wants in the world and can even lift souls up to paradise. I do not wish to, he wrote in his journal, October the 12th, 1492, I do not wish to delay, but to discover and go to many islands to find gold. In the first meeting with the Arawaks, Saturday 13th of October, 1492, I kept my eyes open and tried to find out if there was any gold. And I saw that some of them had little piece of it hanging from a hole in their nose. Michel de Cuneo said, it seemed to the Lord Admiral that it was time to put into his execution his desire to search for gold, which was the main reason he had started on so great a voyage full of so many dangers. He demanded the natives give him, his men, gold, food, and sex. And non-compliance, they cut off their hands and gouged out eyes. Columbus was the instigator of the transatlantic slave trade. He carried out slavery on an industrial scale. Columbus sent 5,000 Indians across the Atlantic, slaves, possibly more than any other individual. Of the 500 Indians Columbus sent back to Spain in 1495, 200 died en route. He was not above selling slaves for sex. 100 Castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. And there are plenty of dealers looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. He was a thoroughly nasty man. Columbus set the standard for the treatment of the indigenous people of America. But in 1499, accusations of incompetence and tyranny reached Ferdinand and Isabella. So he was shipped back in chains along with his brothers. And in 2005, there was exciting discovery, but the report turned up in the state archives by Francisco de Bobadilla. And in that report, a woman who had dared to suggest that Columbus was of lowly birth was punished by his brother Bartolome. She was stripped naked and paraded around the colony on the back of a mule. Bartolome then ordered that her tongue be cut out, and Columbus congratulated him for defending the family. And Haiti, there was, as a result of the suffering and hard labor they endured, the Indians chose suicide. This is a letter to King Ferdinand in 1517. Occasionally, 100 have committed mass suicide. Many have killed their children with their own hands so as not to leave them in such oppressive slavery. What we committed in the Bartolome de las Casas, what we committed in the Indies stands out amongst the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind. And this trade as one of the most unjust, evil, and cruel among them. Some of the American school textbooks claim that there was as few as 1 million people living in America when Columbus landed. It's better to colonize a wilderness. Actually, the population of America was probably similar to Europe, between 60 and 90 million or 75 90 million. The indigenous populations now in North America, it's 3.6 million, and in South America, it's 43 million. I think this is to do with the actual the Spanish brought in. It's a myth that the Spaniards were crueler than the Europeans in North America. Oh, sorry. It's contrary to the myth. The Spanish tried to put preservation of the Indians. They tried to preserve the Indians. Christopher Columbus not only opened the door to a new world, but also set an example for us all by showing what monumental feats can be accomplished through persistent perseverance and faith. George W. Bush in 1989. To denigrate Columbus is to denigrate what is worthy in human history and in us all. And those who criticize Columbus are endangering this nation's ability to compete and flourish in the 21st century. That's financial journalist. There was attempts to canonize Columbus. In New York Times, in an editorial in 1875, there is no doubt that the stout old admiral would make a very creditable saint, as saints go. He gave us a new world, not only merely to Castile and Leon, but to the human race. Well, obviously not to those who were living there at the time. And the Catholic, Connecticut Catholics newspaper, as American Catholics, we do not know anyone who more deserves our grateful remembrance than the great and noble man, the pious, zealous, faithful Catholic, the enterprising navigator, and the large-hearted and generous sailor Christopher Columbus. That was in 1878. But the Vatican vetoed it because sainthood, because he'd done no miracles and he had a bastard son. There was no mention about the enslaved 5,000 people, killed thousands more, and made the USA a racist state. The last word. Yes, this is from Justin Windsor, who is an eminent historian, librarian of Harvard University. in 1891 to 2. The New World is his monument. Its discoverer might have been its father. He proved to be its despoiler. He might have given its young days such a benignity as the world likes to associate with a maker. He left it a legacy of devastation and crime. He might have been an unselfish promoter of geographical science. He proved a rabid seeker for gold and viceroyalty. He might have won converts to the fold of Christ by the kindness of his spirit. He gained the execrations of the good angels. And finally, the most enterprising representation of the globe, it's... Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Well, that was the kind of barnstorming and, if I might say it, cheeky performance that we've come to expect from Terry Jones. We'll be hearing a little more from him later. But now I'm going to introduce the second speaker. One of the problems about deciding what the Middle Ages means to modernity, of course, we have to define first what the Middle Ages are and when they were. So if 1492 and Columbus's contact with America is taken as one of those solar dates, historians call them, that you might mark the end of a narrative about an epoch like the Middle Ages, then a solar date that you might look to at the beginning of the Middle Ages is most commonly found in the fall of the Roman Empire, as long as we can decide what we mean by the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And that's something that our next speaker has spent a large part of his career thinking about and writing about. So Professor Patrick Geary is Professor of Western Medieval History at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton at the moment, although he has taught, it seems to me, I looked at his CV, at almost every important university in the world, or either as a visiting lecturer or on their staff at some point in his career. The first work he did in 1978, I have to keep talking as long as possible about him, of course, while Tony, the tech guy, switches the computers around. The first work he did in 1978 was about the practice, apparently much more common than you might think, of monks stealing a saint's body from a rival church to carry to their own so that they could be more important. The book that he produced was called Furta Sacra, Thefts of Relics in the Central Middle Ages, although he quipped to me last night that if he'd have called it Body Snatchers from the Dark Ages, he would be considerably wealthier than he is now. He then went on to do an important book called Before France and Germany. I want you to remember that part of the title. Before France and Germany, The Creation and Transformation of the Merovingian World, which his French publisher decided to translate as Naissance de la France. Rather unfortunate distortion of the original idea there. But his work has led him to consider, over the last couple of decades really, what happens in the 18th and 19th century as certain kinds of nationalism, and nationalisms that become particularly toxic in the 20th century, the way they look back to the early Middle Ages for origin myths to justify themselves. And so there was a very important and also very readable book called The Myth of Nations, the Medieval Origins of Europe, that Patrick brought out in 2002. And have I just about managed, Tony, to keep going to the key point? That's okay, thank you very much. So Patrick was one of our closing speakers on Friday. We had Seamus Heaney reading from translations of his medieval poetry, and we had Patrick Geary talking about why the early Middle Ages matter. I have to say, I thought they were both absolutely fantastic. Oh, you're laughing at the Middle Ages in the modern world. Right, I'll give way. Please, could you give a warm welcome to Patrick Geary?
Sorry about that, Jerry. Couldn't resist. My sense is it's an impossible act to follow. We should just go to Q&A for Terry and the Flat Earth Society. Well, my sense is that for most people in England, I don't know about Scotland where I just was, and certainly in the US, the Middle Ages are primarily a place of escapism and amusement. And certainly we've been amused by Terry Jones's Middle Ages. Unfortunately, that is not all there is to the Middle Ages, and I've spent a lot of time on the continent, and I want to talk a little bit about other ways that the Middle Ages seem to me to engage contemporary issues in Europe, and Chris has mentioned some of this. I'll start with this. Since this is the British Academy, I'm sure that everyone recognizes this coat of arms. Am I correct? This is the snow leopard, which is supposedly the totemic animal of the Alans. Now, you all remember from your history classes who the Alans were. They were one of these barbarian peoples who come riding into Europe, presumably an Indo-European language-speaking group, along with the Vandals and the Suebi, who bounce around Europe, establishing themselves in the Caucasus, all the way into Spain, the ancestors of maybe the Portuguese, before the Vandals and a few Swaves and the odd Alan end up in North Africa. Well, we thought that they had all disappeared, but apparently not. In the Caucasus, there are obviously many, many different linguistic groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, whatever you call them, living cheek to jowl. And in particular, there are two communities, the Ions and the Digors, who speak a Iranian Persian language with different identities, different inflections, Christians and Muslims. The Digors increasingly wanting in the late Soviet period and the aftermath of the Soviet Union create their own state, because after all, they were not like the Ions and they needed to divide and also to deal with their identity vis-a-vis their neighbors in the area, until historians and philologists solved the problem for them. And with a little help from good old philology and medieval history, it turned out that there was no need to create a new state because they were all actually the Alans. Now, these groups are generally called Ossetians. And originally this was the People's Republic of Ossetia, but this is now officially the Republic of North Ossetia Alania. They're all Alans. This is a continuity of the great Alanic people who invaded the region at the end of antiquity, and everything is fine. A little medieval philology, a little bit of textual criticism, their language is related to these languages. So these are the Alans, and everything is great. Unfortunately, of course, there are other Ossetians, right, in the region, also living in what is the Republic of Georgia. But Ossetians must be with the Ossetians, and the result was not very pretty a few years ago in the wars between South Ossetia and Georgia. This is an example of what happens when the Middle Ages are made modern and get mixed up into national ethnic ideology. Now, this is a particularly recent and perhaps horrendous example, but since the changes, since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, we've seen a lot of these old ideas. Terry's Columbus is large, if you notice the dates of most of these publications, not George Bush, but I mean, he's perhaps pretty antediluvian himself, but most of the 19th century, and a lot of this is 19th century ideology picked up again at the end of the 20th century as people begin to look for identity. This is my favorite, the youngest little country coming out of Yugoslavia. Slovenia looks to its Middle Ages, it turns out to be one of the oldest countries in the world, and what I love is that this is looking to the Middle Ages as a bright future. 6th century, when its Duchy of Carantania, first Slovene state known for its democratic organization, legal system, popular election of dukes, and progressive women's rights. Now, this is a use of the Middle Ages that we can all get on board with, right? I think that this is terrific. Progressive women's rights and popularly elected dukes in the 6th century, making it not only one of the most ancient, much older than this upstart England and its elected government, but progressive women right. Women apparently had the right to vote in the 6th century. Not all of these is quite as much fun. Here we have the Basque Kingdom dating back to a period when Navarre was a kingdom, and this is a Basque separatist website that suggests that actually there was a medieval kingdom, therefore there should be a medieval kingdom, therefore it's all right to kill Spanish police. Gets uglier these days in Hungary with Jobbik, which means right, the right party that wears uniforms as close as you can get to the cross arrow without absolutely crossing over the line, and talking about the period of the Magyar invasion, the original season of the land, which of course empty, understood there were no Slavs, no Vlachs or anyone else there, and again making claims about Hungary based on the late 9th and early 10th century. This is their ancestral homeland forever. So these medieval ideas about that moment when a territory was conquered, the original moment of primary acquisition, all claims before are now invalid, all changes afterwards don't matter. History is reduced to an instant. So far, no real violence outside, terrible violence against Roma, increasing pressure on Jews because they are not Magyar, or maybe they are, or who knows. But in other places, of course, it's been much worse. This is Slobodan Milosevic talking about the importance of Kosovo. The question of Kosovo is not only a question of territory or number of Serbian or Albanian population, it's an inalienable national treasure indispensable for the identity of the Serbian people. And these are, of course, are all Orthodox monasteries burned by the Kosovars, which is, of course, also true. But what the medieval past of Kosovo has to do with the territory that is now over 90% Albanian is another question. But history matters, but not as a time of change, but as a moment of primary acquisition. But we don't have to just beat up on Eastern Europe. We can talk about your neighbor, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and his daughter now leading the organization. The French people are born with the baptism of Clovis in 496, who have carried this inextinguishable flame, the soul of a people, for 1,000 years. Well, if you weren't baptized with Clovis, you must not be French. So Muslims and Jews need not apply. So these are the kinds of issues that we see spreading again in Eastern Central Europe, also Western Europe, under the pressure of both looking for a past after a period of socialist domination, and as well as concerns about contemporary issues of migration, instability, fear of the loss of identity and heritage, which we see increasingly across Europe. Well, these ideas, this attempt to look back to the Middle Ages for the justification for the moment that makes a state, a nation, a people, is a very powerful return to 19th century scholarship. Not Washington Irving, but much better scholars than Washington Irving, who nevertheless combined philology, that is study of language, history, and archaeology to create a package to find when is that moment that European peoples became European and became specifically in Europe a specific people, an identity which is immutable, fixed, eternal, that moment when one acquired one's territory and also forever and always one's enemies. And this has been a powerful movement in portions of the continent over the last 20 years. The idea is that we have all of these barbarian migrations, people wander around, and at the end of the process, we have the new Europe. Well, that kind of 19th century history, which was very powerful in the creation of nations, very attractive to places like Germany that didn't have a state but had a people, or places like France that had a state, but it wasn't clear that there was a French people. You could kind of worked this out. It became a formula, a package, just add water, put it together, add language, history, and archaeology, and you could come up with a nation, a people who should have their own army and their own flag. Well, we're getting away from that. We are now told by sociologists and modern politicians that all that matters is economy, European peace, harmony, questions of the euro, wonderful stable currency, and these old ancient issues don't matter. That it's all questions of invented traditions cooked up in the 19th century, and there is no resonance in the past. That doesn't really work. That doesn't fly with the vast majority of the population in the regions that I have been studying recently. But then there's another side. They're very good progressive people who say, oh, this is a terrible thing to do with the Middle Ages. This is old 19th century nationalism. We need to look to the Middle Ages to find that source of unity, those things that make Europeans love each other, not divide each other. In 2000, the mayor of Hamburg, at a meeting of Poles and Germans, announced that a meeting that took place in the year 1000 between Boris of Tilbury, the Duke of Poland, and the Emperor Otto around the tomb of St. Adalbert was a sign that whatever happened there can be debated by scholars who listens to them anyway. But the two rulers met each other with attention and respect and emphasized above all the friendship between their peoples. It's wonderful to think that 1,000 years of blood spilled between Poles and Germans can be erased in the year 2000 by reference to a meeting of Otto and Borislav. So using the Middle Ages to say, oh, we've always loved each other, haven't we? Another example, the Visegrad Pact. Now, in the 14th century, there was a meeting of the King of Bohemia and the King of Poland with at the Visegrad, which was the royal palace of the Hungarians, and this has become then a model for the a modern unity, collaboration between the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, even though Slovakia and the Czech and the Slovaks have recently gotten divorced. There are real tensions with Hungary that can't seem to get over 1922 and so forth. But looking to the Middle Ages for some sort of unity, looking to Visegrad as a great moment, and also trying to make Visegrad into a World Heritage Site that would pack in the tourists. There's an economic end to that. It didn't work at this Visegrad, but it did here at the Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic Bridge. This bridge became, in Bosnia, a World Heritage Site recognized by UNESCO. And at the dedication, the director of UNESCO announced its cultural value transcends both national and cultural borders. This was said at the dedication. Unfortunately, the dedication did not take place here because this area was the site of absolutely horrific murders. And it was an unsafe area for UNESCO and the celebratory group talking about the love of Serbs and Bosniaks to actually go to. So they're now excavating what the reality of this eternal love and respect may have been. Now, what concerns me as a professional historian is, ought we to manipulate the Middle Ages to say, oh, this is a source of great unity? Is that because it's in a good cause, should we do that? Is that any better use of the past than the kind of 19th century or neo-nationalist projects that manipulate it as a source of enmity? Is that what we should do with the past? Are we supposed to use the past to find unity? And where are we going to find this unity? Now, you may soon be leaving this organization. I don't know. That's really up to you. But before you know, I'll know, because NSA is, of course, collecting all of your emails and discussions. But please, you have to understand this. This is to your advantage. If your hard disk crashes, if you lose your email, write the CIA. They've got it. They'll send it right to you. So this is a free service offered by my government. Don't thank me. Don't thank me. Thank Mr. Obama. So where are we going to find this new movement? Okay, we have the Visegrad states. We have Visegrad. Where are we going to find the unity in the past? Maybe it's not in a people. Maybe it is in Christian Europe. Now we have something that we can rally around, don't we? We have something that can be best. Now, what Christian Europe? Well, it's got to be the Middle Ages, the time of conversion. Europe becomes Christian, and in becoming Christian, it finds itself. And they're very fine progressive historians who are really into that sort of thing. It scares me to death. Orthodox and Latin Christians didn't get along too well when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople and put a prostitute on the main altar, the Hagia Sophia. They said then the Turks would not have been as cruel, and later on they found that that was pretty much the case. Christian unity and toleration with each other, St. Bartholomew Day's massacre. Christians are not a friendly, peaceful people in some absolute sense, what religion is. Is there some essential Christianity that's de-Christianized happy Europe today? Well, Christianity has a pretty dark past to organize itself around. If you happen to be Jewish in the 15th century, it did not seem like the kind of thing you wanted to get involved in. The problem with using Christianity, medieval Christianity, that time of unity in society, again, looking to the past, the cultural identity to put this together, seems to me very, very problematic. Why is it being done? Probably has more to do with concerns about internal immigration, about Turkey, than it does about the Middle Ages and European identity. It becomes a problem in terms of excluding certain areas. There may be many reasons why Turkey shouldn't be part of Europe, just as there are reasons why Britain might not want to be part of Europe. But I'm not sure that religion has a lot to do with it. Or in Switzerland, where new minarets have been banned because we must not have minarets. We have one kind of minaret already in Switzerland. One kind is enough. It messes up the skyline to have these other minarets because Switzerland has the pointy ones and not these others. Personally, I think the real reason you can't have minarets is that it's extremely dangerous for the primary symbol of Switzerland, which is the cow, and impaling cows on minarets is a constant problem. Well, what am I suggesting here? I'm putting myself out of a job. Medieval historians and philologists, archaeologists got their chairs, got their funding in the 19th century because we called into being the nation. And we're not so sure that that's the right way to go these days. Using history in order to identify the essence of the present is a very dangerous thing. Europeans, whether Europeans exist or not, collectivities have existed for a long time. They are real. Ethnic identities are real, but they are shifting, they're changing, they're protean. Looking back to a Middle Ages, to a past, somehow to find the essence that must be recovered is not history. History is about change over time in human society. And whether it's claiming that medieval Christianity or medieval Serbs or medieval Franks somehow tell us who people are today is a very, very dangerous business in my mind. The role of the historian, we'll have to talk about that. Maybe we're just the guard dog that snarls at the politician and the ideologue and the journalist when they try to perpetrate this sort of thing. I think that what we have to understand that these essences, these identities, are of a moment. what it meant to be French, German, Serbian, British, English in the past was very different. What it will be in the future is very different. History didn't stop and we can't freeze it. History is not something in the past that we study. It's the world, the round world in which we live. Thank you.
An inspirational talk. I feel a bit like a king in a medieval throne room. This feels slightly ridiculous between the two of you. I thought we'd kick off, perhaps I'll ask Terry and Patrick a couple of questions and then we'll throw it out to the floor. I think we do have enough time for that. So Terry and Patrick, I thought I'd ask you first of all, do you think there's anything exceptional about the Middle Ages compared to other periods of history when we're thinking about their use either in contemporary politics, such as your work's been concerned with, Patrick, or the Middle Ages as a source of inspiration for artists, such as you, Terry, when you're making a film like The Quest for the Holy Grail. Is that different from, say, using the past of classical antiquity or the Victorian era? Is there something special about the Middle Ages to modernity or not? Or it's just the past?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I think there is something special, and I think it is this combination of familiarity and distance. The Victorians are very close to us, and the Romans and the Greeks are infinitely distant from us. The medieval world is recognizably us, non-us. There's just enough there that we can feel a connection with that world. And yet it's a very, very strange place. And it is that combination that is represented in various ways in different kinds of scholarship and popular imagination, which makes it a continuing object. It's also very important to modernists, because the modernists invented the Middle Ages, they need a Middle Ages, you've got to have a Middle Ages to react against. What would modernity be if we didn't have a Middle Ages to kick? So there is a positive sense of alien and familiar, and then its use by those who want to say they're thoroughly modern. They're not medieval. Terry?
I think we all want to believe in progress, you know, and we want to seem to have got better than the past, and I think Patrick's right. The Middle Ages is it's not so it's more familiar, but it's not as familiar as the antique world, and it's we need someone to kick. I mean, I think you're right. We want to prove that we're better than the past was.
I think in both of your answers there's an idea of teleology that's important, isn't it? The Middle Ages are called into being by Petrarch, first of all, as saying, I've lived through a dark age, but he writes to a friend and say, you might come again to an age of light. So it's called into being as exactly in order to be able to write that narrative of progress that you're both talking about. I thought another question I'd ask you to consider is essentially one about praxis. So we've got on the one hand an academic historian of the Middle Ages, on the other Terry, an artist, a writer, a director, although as I said, one who does do also serious scholarship on literature of the 14th century. But what does a filmmaker and an historian have to say to each other over the Middle Ages? What are the commonalities here? What's the point of a forum like this where we bring you together to talk about the Middle Ages?
Well, I mean, I've always been interested in the Middle Ages, and you know, making Monty Python and the Holy Grail was for me, you know, a dream come true. I mean, and actually, one of our Vikings in Eric, the saga of Eric the Viking, or the Vikings, Eric the Viking, a film I made in 1990. One of the Vikings said, he was a big fat guy, you know. He said, "Wish my dream come true, playing a Viking," yeah, no, I think I don't know. I don't understand the question really.
Let's ask a professor what he thinks of the question.
Well, I think that whether you are a filmmaker or an historian, you are translating a vision. We represent the past. We do it in a fairly dull way, and thus we're called historians. You do it in a very lively way, and you're an artist. But we are trying to make a representation of another world for a public. We are translating something for a public. We have our rules of discourse, our genre. What you can do with a film is determined in part by the medium, by expectations. What we can do in one of our books is also largely determined. But I think we're involved in a similar activity. But we historians like to pretend, oh, no, we're telling you the way it is. We are interpreting the past for a present. You're interpreting the past for a present. I rather like your interpretation.
Well, yes, in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, we wanted to make it look mucky. The Hollywood, get away from the Hollywood version of the Middle Ages. And we wanted to make it mucky. So everybody had to have, all the actors had to have blackened teeth. But I don't think we got that right, actually, because when they dug up the Mary Rose, they raised the Mary Rose up, all these sailors had perfect dentition. And I think it was because it was pre the opening up of the West Indies and the sugar trade. And
Yes. Good. Thank you, both of you. We thought, after kicking off the discussion like this way on the platform, that we'd open it up to you and ask if there are any questions that you'd like to ask, either specifically to Patrick or to Terry or to both. Yeah, hand at the front.
Thank you very much for the two talks. In both of your talks, the 19th century comes across as the villain of the piece. I'm just wondering how the medieval era was seen before that, in the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries, when there was still, Christianity and dynasticism and all of these other pre-modern things, but post-medieval things. How did they see the medieval era?
Well, in the Enlightenment, they like to prove themselves better than because they believed in progress. We're better than the Middle Ages, but they never accused the medieval world of thinking that the Earth was flat.
I think that there is you can find the beginnings of this kind of attitude early on. Certainly with Petrarch already, who is, one would think, in the medieval period, who has a sense of distance. But the perception of these peoples of the early Middle Ages, these settlements, was very, very different because there was a very close identity with them. These are used to fight out contemporary issues. In France, did the Franks invade, or the question is, do they have the right to rule because they are free, ruling a subservient population of Gauls who have been conquered by the Romans, and the Franks are free, and thus the French are real French because they're Germans. An interesting idea in the 17th century that there is not that strong sense of caesura, of break between that world. And these peoples of the early period in representations, people like King Clovis, the first Frankish king, who is represented in animal skins and this wild barbarian, is represented a Roman general into the 18th century, which in fact he was. There is a very different relationship to the past that is not it does not combine politics, the nation, territory, in the way that the 19th century will do this. These elements are floating around there. Tacitus Germania has been there in German ideology, but these things have not come together really till the Napoleonic era.
Good question. Thank you very much. I saw a hand there in the middle, I think, when I was
I'm a history teacher, and one of my jobs is to try and inspire young people with the past. The medieval period is my favorite period. It's my speciality. And I've just started teaching 17-year-olds early medieval history. And it's very difficult to motivate them because, you know, with some of the more modern periods, you can talk about the relation between the world that they know, about motivating them and the things they see on television. The White Queen is one of the things that's on at the moment, and The Tudors was another TV show. It's quite a distorted view of history. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions and whether you thought that teaching, which is supposed to be kind of, you know, the cutting edge of opening up people's minds, how we kind of make the medieval era more relevant to young people when all they see is kind of Hollywood stuff.
Well, I think that that's a very important question. It's very easy for students to identify with much more recent history that's tangible and approachable to them. I find that students are really struck by the visual. And you have the visual and the tactile here. And if you can introduce your students to the physicality of the past, medieval manuscripts, they love them. Whether you can make out the letters, they can read these things, and you connect that to, well, who did this? What is it done on? Why is it on an animal skin and not on paper or on a computer screen? And take them back from where they are. I've seen 8-year-olds very excited about that sort of thing. The other is the kind of presentation that I've just tried to do very, very briefly to say, you know, these things are still alive. They are still present, but present in a toxic way. Let's try to understand what are these things really. Now, whether your students are going to be engaged in questions about Kosovo or not, I would not expect that. But these are big issues that your students need to find a relationship between themselves. And I think that physicality, buildings, objects, it's a start. And if you're enthusiastic, students will be, because they are sponges. They just take it out of you.
There was very early on a gentleman right at the back putting his hand up. Yes, I think it must have been you, sir.
Hi there. Professor Geary, just sort of looking at your talk, you spoke quite a bit about how the medieval, sort of viewing the modern political spectrum through medieval events impacts the world now. How did the peoples of Europe conceptualize and describe their pieces of land and their political status during the medieval era?
The idea that a people and a land, that territory and ethnicity coincide, is a very modern idea. People speak languages, but that is by class or social rank, by profession, by activity. Multilingualism is very, very common. Moving through registers of language, different processes done in different languages. The idea that there is a territory where everybody speaks a language is a very odd idea. It would strike people as strange, I think, in the Middle Ages. There's a sense of identity. There may be an identity, particularly for those people who are politically relevant. That is free males who have an allegiance to a person, to a lord, to a king. That king may or may not speak their language. Or he may speak many languages, and sometimes their language, and sometimes not. But it's a personal rather than a territorial identity. And this ethnic identity is there, but as a program. We are all X, therefore we should act in a certain way, is always projective. It's not descriptive. And in the Middle Ages, we see very heterogeneous groups called together under a label for certain kinds of activities. But it's not territorial, or the territory may be those, it's the people who owe allegiance to that lord in that territory. It's the only thing that produces homogeneous language groups is ethnic cleansing, quite frankly. And this is a very modern phenomenon.
Question in the front row just here.
I'm afraid it's more of a comment rather than a question, but when I was looking at Professor Geary's comments on places in Eastern Europe and their myths about the creation of a state or the creation of an ethnicity, the thing that occurred to me most was the parallel closest to home, Anglo-Saxon England. This idea that England was, well, if you look at what's said about Anglo-Saxon England, that they elected their monarchs, even though it's the same dynasty from Alfred until Harold for 150 years, that women's rights were better when, you know, this rough and ready equality talked about by Doris Stenton, that, you know, essentially Anglo-Saxon England well, the same thing, I thought the same things applied. And the Norman Conquest is something I've studied quite a lot of late, and if you type English as spelt in Anglo-Saxon with a C on the end rather than H, Englis, the websites you get the most hits for are the English Defence League and other websites defending English ethnicity. So those same parallels with far-right groups you will find not just in France, but on your doorstep.
That is true, and if you type in Anglish as opposed to English, there's a whole world out there. I did not use those examples because to this ignorant ex-colonialist who's been beaten up thoroughly by Terry, my sense is that in this country, those groups are quite French, and the groups that I'm talking about are not. Could they ever become more? They certainly were in the past. Racial Anglo-Saxonism was terribly important in the late 19th century. Should we say, oh, we're over that? I think there are a lot of Londoners whose grandparents come from South Asia who are not particularly interested in the glories of the Saxons. But there may very well be other people who are. Could that develop? Could you have a Jobbik-type movement in Britain that pulls out these old myths of Hengist and Horsa again? Seems to me unlikely, but I'm a colonial, I don't know. But you're absolutely right. It's all there in these little groups. And we've just come down from Scotland, which may soon be an independent country. And whether that's only about access to oil money, or whether these myths are being dusted off, I can't say. I understand that the response is that you'll have to pay roaming charges if you come into England from Scotland, and therefore one should not vote for separation. But I don't know how.
The gentleman 4 rows back here that was trying to get my attention, and someone at the back too. Yes, you'll be next.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things I get from modern politics is that you see countries are using history, as you say, to advance political aims. But of course, the trick is you can be incredibly selective. You only pick the bit of history which suits your political purpose, which advances your particular cause. And that surely is the danger. It seems to me that, okay, it's very interesting to know how we got to where we are, but we should continue from here without a constant reference back to ancient lands, ancient history, ancient languages, etc. What do you think?
There was a hand frantically waving at the back for quite a long time now. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Just wondering if someone could mention or say a little bit about the legacy of the Magna Carta, because towards the end of clause 40, it reads something like this: "To none will we sell, to none will we deny or delay right or justice." And that's quite an impressive principle for a bunch of Middle Ages rabble-rousers to come up with, and that's embedded in many constitutions.
Why don't you say something about Magna Carta?
Yeah, I think the Magna Carta was a great book. I mean, it's a big book. Yeah, no, I think something that you quoted there was really right on.
Obviously, it is a document of its time. What does it mean? Well, its meaning has changed over the centuries. As one British justice said to an attorney who was a barrister who was trying to quote Magna Carta, "Don't tell us what Magna Carta means, we decide what it means." But it's a living text. And there are words in that which, although within a larger context, can be seen as a deeply conservative, aristocratic document protecting the rights of all Englishmen or the rights of freeholders. Nevertheless, those words become subversive. And in time, the words such as the ones that you quoted, in time will take on the kind of meaning that we appreciate today. And that's exactly the point about history, that history is change. And one can establish the original meaning of Magna Carta, and one should try to do that. But that is not what it means in the 21st century, and we should be comfortable with the difference. The importance of the past for the present and the difference between the two.
Does anyone have a question for Terry in the room? A couple of people, gentlemen back there, yes, with the glasses.
Yeah, Swatantra Nandamwa. I was interested in what Terry said about Christopher Columbus, and there's a lot I didn't know about Christopher Columbus at all, and there's a lot of, and most of the population out there of the world, I think, don't know as much about Christopher Columbus, the real story about Christopher Columbus, and in fact, he's become quite a myth and a hero. And my question is really about myths and how we can actually get the truth out, how can we actually let people know or educate or, they have this perception of their heroes, these mythological characters. Can these ever be broken down? And there's an example, for example, which in a sense you mentioned one of the films that you made. There's another film that Monty Python also made, which was Life of Brian. And there's a big myth there, in a sense, or it may be a religious myth as well, in a sense. But again, you try to present it as a comic, in terms of comedy, humorous, in a humorous style. Now, could we actually do the same with Christopher Columbus and make a film about that?
Oh, I'd hesitate to make a film about Christopher Columbus because I'd be horrified. It wouldn't go in America. I mean, it wouldn't make any money.
I'm not so sure.
But yeah, no, I think we should all go back to the original documents, like what was written at the time. You mean Columbus's journal? It's clear. And he says what he's doing, and he wants gold, So
I think you're right, and I think that shining the kind of spotlight that Terry does on a figure like Columbus is a very healthy thing to do, and it kind of, putting the bright light there kills the mold. And I think that this is one way to do it. You could write a very serious condemnatory book about Columbus, and there are many, many that have been written. Around 1992, there was an enormous amount written, and these quotes from these ultra-conservative people that Terry presented were responding to the massive rejection of Columbus as a hero, the rejection of the term discovery. It's now encounters, because the population says, hey, we didn't need to be discovered. And so there is that other way. But one way to do it is with satire, and Terry, of course, is the great genius at doing that, and that is a very good way to do it.
There are other ways to, and the question is, what is effective for that audience to communicate, to get people thinking? And I think he's done that this evening.
Now, I know there are lots of questions in the room, which is great. I'm told there's room for one more question, and there is, in fact, another room that's very close to us. There are people different from us, but not so different from us, just beyond us. And I've been asked for a question to come in from the other room, so from the Middle Ages, from the medieval room. Angela, is there a question for us?
Did he think he could have fallen off the end of the earth?
Did Columbus think he could have fallen off the end of the earth? Is that the question, Angela?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I think he knew the world was round because nobody thought that the world was flat in those days, and sphericity never came into the discussion. It was just how far it was round. I think he may have known that America was there. And that's why he got down to 4,000 miles, which is sort of crossing the Atlantic. And I think that's why he got it down to that, because he needed to persuade the committee that were safeguarding Ferdinand and Isabella's investment in the thing. He needed to persuade them that it was much less than 14,000 kilometers.
This is one of the paradoxes of economics and many events in history. If people really knew what they were doing, they wouldn't have done it. And you get into a situation, and halfway through you realize it's a lot harder than you had ever known, but somehow you keep going. I mean, he clearly knew it was round. He knew that he was going to something, whether he thought he was going to Japan or whether he figured that there was something else out there. But you get into these endeavors, and he lied in order to get permission to go. And the people who were saying, don't go, had a lot of reason on their side. But he was a very smooth talker.
A gentleman asked a question about getting young kids interested in the Middle Ages, and I have to say, I now teach medieval literature at St Andrews. I remember at the age of about 13 lying in a sleeping bag on the floor of my friend's bedroom, crying with laughter, watching Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail. I'm quite sure that was a formative influence and many of us in the room are interested in the Middle Ages. Begins with people like Terry, perhaps then it's nuanced by people like Patrick, and we have a great deal to thank both of them for. So could you just warmly thank them for